So this is number 4 in my videos on my trip to learn about the Holocaust. So the first video, if you missed it, was a preview of my trip where I talked a little bit about some of the issues and some of the background of the Holocaust. The second video was what I called a prologue, which was kind of just an overview of the places that we had gone to in Poland and in Germany. And last time I talked more about the history of the Holocaust, how we went to a concentration camp, how we went to the Wannsee estate to learn about how the perpetrators had planned the mass murder that they undertook. I wanted to offer a little more reading background material. In the first video, the preview, I talked about some reading material. So I have a couple of things to add to that. So one book to recommend is Complicity in the Holocaust, Churches and Universities in Nazi Germany by Robert P. Erickson. Erickson had previously written Hitler's Theologians, I think was what the book was called. So this is from 2012. And this is just devastating in terms of the involvement of churches, the support of churches towards the Nazi regime. So there's a lot in here, and that would be interesting if you wanted to follow up on that. A very recent book that just came out at the end of last year, Safety Through Solidarity, A Radical Guide to Fighting Anti-Semitism. So this is not exactly journalism. It's not exactly history. It's kind of a very specific political point of view. They call themselves radicals. They call themselves part of the left. But they give you a very thorough way of thinking about how, from whatever perspective you have, you try to understand anti-Semitism and understand anti-Semitism as it intersects with the political climate that we're in now, and how it intersects with what's happening in Israel after the attacks that began on October 7th and the subsequent war that's happening. So I thought that was an interesting book. That is by Shane Burley and Ben Lorber, and they describe themselves as activists. So they have a very definite point of view, but they're also very upfront about their point of view. And I think they try to give you kind of the spectrum of what is aside from what they have. So let me try to get in a few more pictures and a few more of the things we saw. So last time at the end of my video, or just towards the end of my video, I got us to Poland. So this is Warsaw. We went to 2 places in Poland, Warsaw and Krakow. Krakow had been the capital of Poland at one point, and Warsaw has been the current capital for many years, many decades. So this is Kasia. Kasia was our guide when we got to Warsaw. So I talked about the Warsaw Ghetto and the Warsaw Ghetto walls. And as you trace along the ground, the marker that tells you where the wall was for the ghetto in Warsaw, you also encounter these information plaques. So this plaque says, by order of the German occupation authorities, the ghetto was cut off from the rest of the city. The ghetto area surrounded by a wall was initially certain acres, almost 800 acres, 750 acres. It was reduced in 42. It was divided into 2 parts, and approximately 300,000 Warsaw Jews and 90,000 from the other towns were herded, was a horrible term to kind of imagine, were herded into the ghetto. Nearly 100,000 died of hunger. During the summer of 1942, the Germans deported and murdered close to 300,000 to gas chambers. In 1943, an uprising broke out in the ghetto. So this is a part of the history that maybe is good to touch on, that there were efforts to resist the Nazis by the people that they were trying to kill. So specifically in Warsaw, there was this uprising April 19th. Fighters and civilians perished. We learned that there's an effort to commemorate this uprising every year, and that they use little daffodils. They make little paper daffodils as a way of remembering this time of year and the uprising. This was a museum, a very recent museum that we went to in Warsaw. A 1,000-year history of the Polish Jews. So this was massive, and it was very new. One thing that we learned about was the Cossacks. They were an autonomous community of warriors living in eastern Ukraine. They followed the Russian Orthodox faith. Some were paid by the Commonwealth to defend the borders. However, when the kings and nobles began to restrict their freedom and reduce the number to be paid, the Cossacks led a massive popular rebellion against the nobility, the clergy, and the Jews. In 1648, the largest Cossack rebellion, known as the whatever that is uprising, decimated the Jewish population in the eastern part of the Commonwealth. So I've heard this term Cossacks before. I never really quite was sure what it meant. I knew it had something to do with this part of the history. But this talks about the way in which they were being mistreated by the ruling class, and they took it out on the Jewish population, on a weak part of the population. Something that a lot of people have heard about, the Protocols of the Elder of Zion. It is a forged document purporting to reveal a Jewish plan to dominate the world. It was first published in a Russian newspaper in 1903 and republished as a brochure during the 1905 revolution. The true authors, probably members of the Russian secret police, intended to discredit the revolution as a Jewish invention and to blame Jews for the chaos. The protocols quickly became the most influential anti-Semitic text of the 20th century, translated into many languages. One person who was very taken with this was Henry Ford. He serialized the Protocols of the Elder of Zion in a newspaper that he owned. This was an interesting bit of information that between the wars, the United States sent a commission led by Henry Morgenthau to investigate the situation of Jews in Poland. In his report, he emphasized the anti-Semitism of the Poles. And this is a picture of him. The museum talked about the way in which anti-Semitism operates in stages, how it evolves and how it develops, that there's a stage called humiliation. There's a stage called labeling. There's a stage called forced labor. There's a stage called separation. So each of these stages builds on the one before it. So the Nazis didn't go straight on into genocide. Their aims were very clear that that was what they were headed towards, but they worked at it in a very strategic way, knowing that they had to kind of figure out a way to build support or minimize resistance. So these stages are kind of clearly marked out in this museum. Plunder. When we were in Krakow, we saw a lot of very old buildings that we didn't see in Warsaw, where things are really kind of just completely demolished. Krakow, there's some very old Jewish neighborhoods that are still standing. The Jewish residents are no longer there, but there's been an effort to kind of return some of the old synagogues to the Jewish community. So this was a particular synagogue that had a cemetery, but the Nazis had dismantled a lot of the cemeteries, the Jewish cemeteries, in an effort at desecration. So there had been an attempt to reassemble some of the tombstones, but they would, so broken that they could only be kind of be assembled in kind of this little patchwork that was put into a wall alongside the cemetery. While in Poland, we went to the other concentration camp that was part of our trip. This one was Auschwitz, which is, of course, infamous. They explained to us that Auschwitz was unusual in that it was a concentration or labor camp as well as a death camp, and that a lot of what the Nazis did at the end of the war was to cover up what had happened in the genocide, to erase the evidence, to destroy documents and so forth. And what we were told by our guide was that at Auschwitz, they had a lot of people who were working in the labor camp section of Auschwitz, and that those people witnessed some of what happened in the death camps. So that in other death camps, there weren't any witnesses and the documents were destroyed, and they tried to just erase all evidence. But that Auschwitz ended up being a place where there was a good bit of testimony from people who survived. So this is a map that gives you kind of the scale of what was happening in Auschwitz. Um, People were coming from ghettos and transit camps and prisons from many nations, from many parts of Europe into Auschwitz. Auschwitz was the largest concentration camp and also a mass extermination center. In the years 1940 to 1945, the Nazis deported at least 1.3 million people to Auschwitz, 1 million Jews, 150,000 Poles, 23,000 Gypsies, currently known as Roma, 15,000 Soviet prisoners of war, and 25,000 prisoners from other ethnic groups. Over 1 million of these people died in Auschwitz. Approximately 90% of the victims were Jewish. The SS murdered the majority of them in gas chambers. This is a picture of people arriving at Auschwitz. This was an interesting photo that we saw at Auschwitz of Franciscan priests being rounded up and being taken to the concentration camp. That was something that I read about in Robert Erickson's book, Complicity in the Holocaust, talking about the fact that there was not even a lot of protests registered when Catholic priests in Poland were being rounded up and taken to the concentration camps. This was an exhibit at Auschwitz. The Holocaust was an unprecedented genocide, total and systematic, perpetrated by Nazi Germany and its collaborators, with the aim of annihilating the Jewish people. The primary motivation was the Nazis' anti-Semitic racist ideology. Between 1933 and 1941, Nazi Germany pursued a policy that dispossessed the Jews of their rights and their property, followed by the branding and concentration of the Jewish population. This policy gained broad support in Germany and much of occupied Europe. In 1941, following the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Nazis and their collaborators launched the systematic mass murder of the Jews. By 1945, nearly 6 million Jews had been murdered. We typically use the word Holocaust to describe this event. It's kind of become the way in which it's referred to. Holocaust refers to a Greek term, which is about a burnt offering. So that's never really been an appropriate term for that, but it's just kind of stuck, and that's really what people think of when they hear of Holocaust. They don't think of the old Greek meaning. The Hebrew term that's used more often is Shoah. So Shoah is a Hebrew word, and its biblical root is referring to wasteness and desolation. And it appears in the book of Job, which is a story of undeserved and unimaginable suffering. So you can see why that's more appropriate. This was a quote we saw. It happened, therefore it can happen again. This is the core of what we have to say by Primo Levi. After Auschwitz, we were kind of getting towards the last few days of our trip. We returned to Berlin, and we went to the German Resistance Memorial Center. This was a nice change of pace after being at a death camp, to go back and to learn about the resistance. They also had there a special exhibition about women in resistance against National Socialism. A lot of people, of course, know Dietrich Bonhoeffer as someone who was very important in the resistance movement. This is a quote from Bonhoeffer from 1942. We have been mute witnesses to evil deeds. We know plenty of tricks. We have learned the arts of pretense and ambiguous speech. We have grown distrustful of people through our experience and have often given them no truth and no free word. We have become worn out or perhaps even cynical through unbearable conflicts. Are we still of any use? Bonhoeffer, of course, was arrested and executed for his resistance of the Nazi government. So this is the woman who took us through this resistance center. And we get to this portion where they talk about Stauffenberg, who was a high-ranking official in the German army. A movie was made, a movie called Valkyrie. There's been other movies, but Valkyrie is a very Hollywood version of the story, which starred Tom Cruise. This woman's name was Stephanie. She told us that in meeting Tom Cruise, they were trying to explain to him the complicated nature of Stauffenberg's resistance, that Stauffenberg was not opposed to Nazi policies per se. He was not opposed to genocide or discrimination or persecution. That really his motivation for trying to assassinate Hitler was because the war was going badly. And they were told by Tom Cruise that he didn't want to get into that complexity. He just wanted to show a very simple moral tale about someone who was trying to oppose Hitler. This is, of course, a shocking picture of church leadership that represents what we read about in Robert Erickson's book, of really often enthusiastic support of the Nazi regime. One of the more well-known women featured in the exhibition about women in resistance was Marlene Dietrich. We had a meeting one evening with this woman who is a social worker in Berlin public schools. She talked about how she specifically works with refugee children, refugee families coming in from Syria and then later from the Ukraine. She also works very directly with the Roma children. We talked last time about how people used to be referred to as gypsies, they're now referred to as Roma. And that's a big part of her work. This was a new piece of the story for me. This was an exhibit that was talking about what happened to Germans who were living outside of Germany at the end of the war. So the war ended with a conference at Yalta between Stalin and Truman and Churchill. They redrew the lines of where Germany would be and where Poland would be. And they decided that Germans living outside of the new lines for Germany, who were living in Lithuania or Czechoslovakia or Poland or Ukraine, needed to be relocated back to Germany. So this was a forced relocation. So I had not known about this part of the history, although I've actually now come to realize that I know someone who was actually involved in this. So this permanent exhibition is very new. It depicts European history of forced migration, mainly in the 20th century. Its central focus is on the roughly 14 million Germans who were displaced or expelled in the historical context of World War II. It also talks about other time periods in history, such as the Bosnia conflict, places where there was ethnic cleansing, where people were told that they could no longer live where they were living. So it kind of gave a really broader historical understanding of forced relocation and flight and expulsion. So this museum tried to give a context to forced relocation, talking about historically the invention of the idea of a nation, that after the French Revolution, the idea of a nation gained even greater currency. Initially, common ideas, language, culture, history, and ethnicity all contributed to the forging of a concept of a nation state. In the course of the 19th and 20th century, this took on an increasingly concrete form as nation states were founded within clearly defined borders. Population groups living within these borders who did not fit those perceptions were declared to be minorities. And also the concept of history. What holds a nation together, often a shared past, is a unifying element. But the territories of the new nation states were determined by shifting statehoods and by boundaries dating back to previous centuries. National historical narratives thus combine regional myths with symbolic past events, such as important battles. This is how nation states form in its own cohesive concept of its history. And the development of nationalism is that modern science and technology fundamentally changed European societies from the late 19th century. Biology classified the diversity of life into species and races. Mistaking this as human and social terms, this meant that nation states now understood nationalist and racial criteria to differentiate people both internally and externally. Parallel advances in technology, bureaucracy, and infrastructure allowed populations to be more effectively recorded and administered. This also facilitated exclusion and coercion vis-a-vis minorities. So this was a story that we learned from Bosnia of this woman that in 1992, her mother and her younger sister had to flee to relatives in Dusseldorf. The father managed to join them later. The family was separated again in Germany when her parents and sister faced deportation. They could not return to their Bosnian hometown. They were no longer welcomed in Germany, so they emigrated to the USA. So this was a quote from the US ambassador. The Poles indicated that they do not wish any German population to remain within Polish territory. So that was part of the background to this movement for the Germans to be forcibly relocated. Even though they may have been in Poland or in Czechoslovakia for many, many generations, it was felt that there was no longer a tenable position. After we were in Poland, we then went back to Berlin, and I took the opportunity to go back to the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe and to see the underground exhibit that is a part of that memorial. So you can see here a lot of the displays showing pictures and showing history. There was also a map that showed the sites of persecution and extermination, a map that deals with more than 500 of thousands of sites where Nazi persecution and extermination took place. And that's what that map looks like. All of Europe, North Africa. So as we think about this history, I think it's important then to bring it home and to think about how does the United States decide to look at its history, how to look at the darker parts of our history, some of the violence, some of the discrimination that was carried out. On a drive upstate New York, I saw this memorial to a lynching that took place in New York State in 1892. Robert Lewis, a local Black resident, was mob lynched near this site. So I think in some way, modern Germany took time, but they did begin after maybe a generation or two to think about how to really confront and how to really tell the story of what happened in the Holocaust, in that war period. And I think they could be an example for us in the United States and for other countries to not just mythologize and romanticize our history, but to really look at our history with very clear eyes. I think as religious people, I think as Christians, we have an example in the Bible of how the prophets would speak to the people about being mindful of their own ethical behavior. that sometimes the prophets were in situations where the people were in really extreme circumstances, really desperate circumstances, where the people were being oppressed and persecuted, but the prophets would still call upon them to examine their own behavior in an ethical light. So that, I think, is a great model for us about how it's important for us to be mindful of our behavior, to think of it in the context of our faith and the kind of people we are called to be, also realizing that God is forgiving and compassionate, but that in response, in gratitude for God's grace, we should try to be formed by that grace, by that compassion, and by that love, and by that hunger and thirst for justice. So that's going to be my last report, my last video on my trip to the Holocaust. Again, this was 4 parts, and I thank you for your time.